Hey everyone, it's Monica, and welcome to day 4 of my 12 days of Christmas. Well, today we're going to be creating black and white cards, and black and white cards are some of my favorite types of cards to create, and that's because they are so traditional. And we're going to be using some black embossing powder, and new stencil from the Holtz Christmas collection, as well as one of the new stamp sets. Now, the stamp set that I'm working with today is called Modern Christmas, and it's beautiful, you guys. I just love it. Now, last year I created the black and white cards on the right, the one that I'm showing you right now, and I used paper from Canvas Corp brand. But there's so many ways to create black and white cards. You can use old newspapers, you can use old music sheets, but today I'm going to show you how to create a black and white card just using plain old white cardstock and a stencil and some black embossing powder, and then we're going to use our stamps, of course. So I'm going to make a 5x7 card. And I just started out by cutting some black cardstock, which was 1/4 of an inch smaller than a 5x7 card. And then the white cardstock was 1/4 of an inch smaller than that. And then I went ahead and I matted it. Now, I wanted to be strategic about my embossing paste. So I'm going to do something that I don't normally do. Typically, what I'll do is I'll add my embossing paste, and then I will let it dry, and then I'll do my stamping. But I'm going to actually use my embossing paste around my image, and I'll show you what I mean here in just a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out the stamps that I'm going to use, and I'm going to place my stamps strategically because I'm going to add my embossing paste around my stamped image. Now, when I first saw this stamp collection, I saw it when Tim Holtz did his Facebook Live. What really caught my eye were the sentiments. While the images are really cute, I loved the black the black strip with the white sentiment. I just think that is so classic. But then when I actually got the whole stamp set, of course, I like the images as well. Now, to stamp my images, I am going to be using my Misty because I want to make sure I get nice, crisp impressions. And as you can see on that Winter Wishes, there's a lot of black in that background, so I may have to stamp this a couple of times. Now, the ink that I'm stamping with is the Ranger's Black Archival ink, and this is a really nice, solid black ink, and I love it when I'm working with silhouette images. So I went ahead and I used my Misty, like I said, along with my black ink, and I stamped it a couple of times till I got a nice crisp image on both of my images. And then to add some contrast, I'm going to add some black and white washi tape. Now, the washi tape that I'm using today is from the Tim Holtz collection, and it's from some of the past collections. I have so much of his washi tape at this point that I haven't bought any in a while, but this really is one of my favorites, and it's perfect for black and white cards. It's the black background, and then it has the words, and it kind of matches the actual Winter Wishes stamp, so I thought it was a perfect addition to the card. And not only that, but it also helps to add a little, like I said, a little contrast to the black and white card. Now, I ended up adding the washi tape to the bottom of the card because I also thought it could work to help ground the actual deer. Sometimes when you have a deer that's not actually on something, it looks like he's floating in air a little bit, and washi tape is a nice way to also ground your images. Now, I know not everybody has the black texture paste, so I wanted to give you another way to actually use this stencil and control where the actual stenciled part of the image will show up. So I'm going to be using one of my distress crayons, and the color that I'm going to be using is Black Soot. Now, the stencil set that I got is the smaller set, and to be honest, I typically get the bigger stencils, but I wanted to get the smaller ones because I knew I was going to be using it on some Christmas cards, and I wanted to be able to strategically place some of the stencil part on my card, and I thought the smaller parts would work a lot easier and look a lot better on smaller cards. So I'm just holding down my stencil and I'm using my Black Soot Distress Crayon, and I am adding it through my stencil. And I am being really careful to place my stencil where it's not going to smear. Keep in mind when you are using your distress crayons, they are going to still be a little tacky initially, so you want to give it time to dry. So you don't want to add part of your stencil over what you've already stenciled, because it might smear it and you certainly don't want that. I'm going for a crisp black image, so I want to make sure that I'm really careful not to smear what I've already stenciled onto my card. And this is actually one of the first times that I've been strategic about how I'm using my stencil. Typically, like I said, I'll just put it over my cardstock and I'll go to town. But here I'm kind of placing where part of that stencil is showing up. And I really love the effect. And if you've never worked with the distressed crayons before, it's going to give kind of a 3D look. It's going to pop up a little bit. So it'll be a real nice addition to your card. Now, one thing I have to warn you, as you saw, I did use my finger to actually add the distressed crayon through the stencil, and you want to make sure that before you move on to the next step or create another card, that you do wash your hands really well, because if you don't, that distressed crayon is going to get all over your cards. So I'm going to go ahead and put this card aside so the distressed crayon can dry, and now we're going to move on to another design. So the next stencil that we're going to use is the plaid stencil, and we're going to stick with the black and white theme. So I'm going to be using some black and white distress ink for this. Now, as you can see, the smaller stencil doesn't actually fit over the card base, so we're going to have to kind of position it to make sure we can have full coverage. If you're using the bigger stencil, you probably will be able to get a full coverage on an A2 card. But again, since I am working with the smaller stencil, we're going to have to reposition it after we get some of our ink on part of our card. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is of course add our blue painter's tape, and this is going to hold down our stencil so it doesn't move. And I'm going to be using one of my brushes from Picket Fence. Now, you could easily use your blending brushes or your blending tool, but I wanted to make sure that I had a really light touch. I didn't want to have to put too much pressure on it, and that's why I really like the brushes from Picket Fence. It doesn't take much to actually get a nice impression, and I was going for a subtle background. I didn't want it to be really dark as it was with the distressed crayons, so the Picket Fence brushes worked really nicely. Okay, so once I get my coverage on this first layer, then I'm going to want to go ahead and lift up my stencil, and I'm going to shift it to the right. Now, when I shift it, I'm going to have to line up those blocks exactly in the same pattern in order to continue the pattern over to the right. But you're going to see once I get going here, it wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. It ended up turning out okay, but it wasn't lined up exactly perfect. But you know what? I'm okay with imperfection. I knew that I was going to be adding something over it, so I wasn't overly concerned about it not being matched up perfectly. So I went ahead and I just matched up as best that I could, and then I taped it down with the tape that I had, and then I continued with the inking to finish my pattern. And you're going to see, even when I lift up the stencil, the top right corner isn't even completely with the pattern. And I was okay with that. I really wanted it to look organic. I don't like things to look too perfect. And that's one of the reasons I've always been pulled to the vintage inspired or the distressed cards, because it doesn't have to be perfect. And I'm certainly not a perfect card maker. So if I do make my mistakes on my cards, then I can just kind of chalk it up to the design. All right, so now that I have my background, and like I said, it's a little bit wonky, but I'm okay with it. If you want to be a little bit more precise, then you may want to just take your time and line it up a little bit more perfect than I did. But if you're going to be covering it, honestly, it doesn't have to be perfect. All right, so once you get your stenciling done, you're going to definitely want to clean up your work area, because you're going to have some ink around it with some of the stenciling. And then we're going to go ahead and start to work on the image that's going to go on top of the pattern. So the image that we're using for the top of the card, as you can see, is the Christmas tree. And it was a really nice choice, because I think it was a nice contrast to the background that I had chosen. Now, you might be thinking that there's too much black on this card, but you're going to see once we put it together, there isn't a white contrast between the background and the actual white within the Christmas tree, that it really works. So just you got to trust me on this. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp this a couple of times. And as you can see, I'm switching, or I'm alternating my inks. I'm using my Archival ink, and then I'm also using my scrapbook.com ink. And I do this a couple of times. I have found that I get a really nice coverage when I combine my inks this way. Sometimes when I'm just using one or the other, I don't get a nice crisp image. Now, this could be all in my mind, I know, or maybe I just need to add some more ink. But the combination seems to work for me, and I do this a lot. Okay, so now that I have a nice crisp image, then I'm going to go ahead and fussy cut my Christmas tree. And this takes no time at all, because as you can see, you have some real nice straight lines here. And you can easily do this with a nice pointy pair of scissors. And as you can see, I'm using my Tim Holtz tonic scissors, and I'm using the larger ones, and they seem to work just fine. Okay, so I ended up adding some foam tape to give my tree some dimension. I did want it to pop up just a little bit because I am using black and white. I didn't want it to be right on the black and white background, so I just popped it up a little bit. And that, as you can see, the contrast between the dots and the squares works really well. So I didn't think it was too much black. I thought there was enough white contrast to make it work. Okay, so once I have my tree in my background, then I want to go ahead and start to put some layers on my card. And of course, I'm going with the black and white card, so I'm going to be using black cardstock. But even if I wasn't using or creating a black and white card, I always seem to go with black for my layers. I think it's just really classic. I love the way it works. Not to say that another color wouldn't work with another card, but I just tend to go with the black for my framing of my images. Okay, and as you can see, it's perfect. It just works really nicely. I think white would have been too white, and black is just a nice contrast. Okay, so another item that I'm going to be adding to my card is some stickers from this sticker book. And this is called the Christmas Noel sticker book from Tim Holtz Ideology. If you recall, I did get the Halloween one, and I really liked it. These are just like ephemera pieces, but they have stickers, so they're really nice additions to your cards. And as you can see, this little music piece here is black and white, and it's going to be perfect to go right on the bottom of the card. There's lots of stickers in this book, and not only do you get stickers, but you also get little word snippets as well. So I think this is a really good value, and it's definitely worth purchasing. The only thing I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with yet are the little holiday tags, and while they're really cute, I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with those yet, but I think the pack is certainly worth taking a look at. And then I'm going to be adding a sentiment to the bottom of the tree to work as its stem. The sticker sentiment that I'm working off of is a metallic sticker, and it's from one of my past collections, but it was a great addition as well. And I was able to find a word sentiment that was just the perfect size to work like a stem. Okay, so once I got that stem in place, I'm going to go ahead and put this card base aside, and we're going to work on our last card. And the last card is going to be the card where we're going to be using that black texture paste. Okay, so for the last card, we're going to be working with the stamp set called Christmastime 2. And the Christmastime 2 stamp set is the large sentiment stamps. Now, last year he came out with another large Christmas stamp set, sentiment set, and I did get it, and I really loved it. And then when I saw this one, it just had some more with different fonts and different sizes, and I thought I would go ahead and add it to my collection. Believe it or not, I don't buy every single one of Tim's releases. While I would love to, I can't afford to do that. So I have to be strategic and really choose which stamps that I like the best. And while it may not have made sense to buy another sentiment stamp, these big stamps I think are perfect, because not only do they work for the outside of your cards, but they're great for the inside as well, especially with those 5x7 cards. Sometimes I think those smaller sentiments just don't work with the 5x7 cards, but these big sentiments are perfect. And Tim was really strategic with his release this year, because not only does this sentiment stamp work great on its own, but it also works great with the stencil set that I used earlier, and that's what I'm going to be using with the black texture paste. All right, now if you've never worked with texture paste before, I'm going to give you a couple of tips here. It's always a good idea to use heavier cardstock. I wouldn't recommend the watercolor cardstock because that doesn't give you a nice crisp stamp, in my opinion. So just get heavier cardstock when you're working with texture paste. Another thing, when you are working with the texture paste, you want to make sure that you clean off your tools right after you use it, because once the texture paste dries, it's going to get really hard. So if you're using a palette knife or one of your tools, if it dries, it's going to be really kind of hard to get off. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now the stamp that I'm working with is the stamp that has the word peace, and then I'm going to also be working with the bird stamp on the stamp set that we worked with earlier. And you're going to see on the Christmastime 2 stamp set, there is a shining star that has some lines, and I'm going to position that stamp sideways to use it as a perch. Now there's so many ways that you can go with this design. You can easily position the piece lower, higher. You can turn the cardstock the other way and have it go horizontal. But I'm just going to show you one way here. But just keep that in mind. When you are creating your Christmas cards, you don't need to have a lot of stamp sets. You can just have like 2 or 3 and then just create different designs with them. And that's what I love about the sentiment stamps, because you're going to get, let's see, you get 3, 6, you get 7 sentiments, or I should say you get 5 sentiment, and then you're going to get some snowflakes, and then you're going to get that shining star. And just with the combination of these stamps, you can easily create really nice cards combined with the black and white stamps that we're using here. So if you buy any stamp set, these two work really well together. Now I am going to go ahead, like I said, and use the bird on this one, but as you can see, the bird looks kind of funny, just kind of in the air. And if you take that star stamp that's part of the sentiment set and turn it on its side, it works perfectly as a perch. And that's what I'm going to show you in just a moment here. So once I figured out exactly where my stamps are going to go, I'm going to go ahead and get out my Misty once again, and I'm going to stamp my sentiments. And even though it looks like there's a lot of white around this card, we're going to be using the black texture paste to add some of those stars like we did earlier on the first card using the distress crayon. But this time, like I said, we're going to be using the black texture paste. All right, so I went ahead and I used my Misty and I stamped out the word peace, and then I also stamped out the perch. I didn't stamp out the bird, as you're going to see, because I wanted to be able to have a lot of white space to add my texture paste. All right, so what you're going to see here when I'm finished is I'm going to have my piece, and then I'm going to have that for the bird. But you're going to also see that I did have some places where the ink smeared a little bit. But I can easily cover this with my texture paste when I start to add my stars. So if you do have any imperfections, keep in mind you can always cover those with the next step or the next layer. So again, we're working with the smaller star stamp, and we're going to position it around the word peace, and we're going to also keep in mind where our little bird is. Most of my stars are going to be towards the left anyway, because I didn't want to take the chance of actually adding texture paste where my bird's going to be stamped. So if you've never used texture paste before, it has the consistency of frosting. Most of the texture paste that I've worked doesn't dry on me, so I've had jars of this, and it's lasted me several months, even into a year, and it hasn't dried out on me. I have more problems with other product, and I'm not going to bash any product here that dries out on me, but the texture paste tends to be pretty good. And then what you're going to do is you're going to want to have sort of a palette knife to get your texture paste out of your jar and then rub it over your stencil. Now, the one thing with texture paste versus the distress crayon is it's not as controlled. With the crayon, I could easily add my black soot right over the image and then use my finger to control where the color is going to go. But with the texture paste, it's a little bit more difficult to control, so you just want to kind of keep that in mind. And you are going to still have some of that texture paste have some of a 3D effect. So when it dries, it will pop up a little bit. It's not real flaky. It will dry really nicely, so you just have to give it time to dry. And then I'm just going to continue on adding some of the texture paste around the left side, and then I'm going to add some of it right above the sentiment, and then I'm going to continue on to add it on the bottom. Now, because we are going to be stamping that bird image, you just want to make sure that you leave enough space so that your bird will fit there. You definitely do not want to add extra paste and then try to stamp over that, because that's just going to mess up your image. So just be strategic when you are adding your texture paste, especially when you are trying to position it just like this. And then once you're finished adding your texture paste, then you're going to want to be really careful to lift up your blue painter's paint, and just to make sure that your stencil comes straight up and that you don't smear it. Keep in mind your paste is still wet, so you're going to want to be really careful when you are taking your stencil off. And then you're going to want to set it aside and just give it time to dry. Now, the one nice thing about the texture paste is that it is pretty fast drying, so it's not going to take very long for you to actually start working on your stamped image. Once I pulled off my stencil, I went ahead and I added some black washi tape just to give a little bit more contrast on the bottom, and then I just gave it a few minutes to set. But in this time, if you are going to be creating a couple of cards, you can easily just put one card aside and then come back to the first one after you're finished. Now, as you can see here, when I was lifting the stencil, it did shift a little bit, and if it does do that, it might create a little bit of marks, so you want to be careful with that. And then if you don't like some of those imperfections, you can easily just use your palette knife to scrape off some of the excess. And then what I'm going to be doing here in just a minute is I'm going to be using some washi tape to cover up some of that imperfection on the bottom. All right, so as you can see with the palette knife, you're not able to get all of those imperfections off. So if it really bothers you, you can easily go back in with your Distress Crayon and try to cover that up. You know, when you're trying to be strategic with your texture paste, sometimes you're not going to get it perfect. You can easily come in with your Distress Crayon, like I said, and cover it up. And that's why I wanted to show you in the beginning how to use the stencil with your Distress Crayon, because if you want to do a combination, then you can easily do that as well. Now, you could have easily come in and used your Distress Crayon for all of the coverage like I did on this card, but that would have just taken too long. And as you saw, the texture paste is pretty quick. It's just not as precise. So the combination of the two probably will get you the best results. So that's what I'm going to be doing here is I bring in my Distress Crayon. I'm going to cover up some of these imperfections. And then another way that you can cover up imperfections are with your Nuvo drops. Nuvo drops have saved me endless times, especially when I have stamping errors. So the Nuvo drops are great to cover up some of your little mishaps, and stickers are great as well. So just kind of be creative with your design. If you find that you do have some errors, or if you have some excess texture paste where you don't want it, just be creative about covering it up. Even if you knew that you were going to be adding some sort of an image over your background, you can be strategic in placing your image over some of those imperfections. So it's not a total loss. If you do make a mistake on a card, don't feel like you have to toss it, or, you know, it's going to be a card for the trash can. You can easily fix it, because there's so many products out there that will help you cover up some of those imperfections. And then once I was done with my background, then I just came in with my bird and I stamped my bird right on my little perch that I had created. And then to finish off the card, you're just going to back it with some black cardstock, and then you mount it onto your white card base. But I did add a few final touches before I actually mounted it onto my black cardstock. I ended up coming in with some black Nuvo drops, as I had recommended earlier, just to touch up some of those areas. And then I also wanted to add a sentiment, and then I used a sentiment sticker from my metallic sticker set, and it really finished the card nicely. So with that pretty much completes the fourth card in my 12 Days of Christmas card series. I hope that you've been enjoyed this series so far, and I'm trying to give you ideas for your Christmas cards. As always, I'll leave a list of all the products that I'm using to create the cards along with the links to the stores. And if you're enjoying my videos, I would sure appreciate a thumbs up and a share. I am almost at 6,000 subscribers, and I would really love to hit that milestone with this 12 Days of Christmas video series. So anything that you can do to help me reach that goal, I would really appreciate it. Now, if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, don't forget to hit that subscribe button before you head out, and hit the little bell. That'll notify you when my next video comes up, which will be the day after tomorrow. Also, don't forget to leave a comment, because I am going to be using your comments for a drawing at the end of the video series, and I'll be giving away some of my digital images from my shop, as well as a few other items. All right, everybody, thank you much for stopping by, and we'll see you again next time.